is Heather Greene, whiskey expert and author of Whiskey Distilled, a Populist Guide to the Water of Life, and this is Whiskey School. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm really having a good time teaching what I know about whiskey. I've spent many years in the industry, and I'm really excited to share what I know with you so that you can become a better consumer. And today I want to talk about malted barley. So if you were with me last class, we went through the predominant grains that we use to make whiskey. Well, in Japan, Ireland, Scotland especially, we're using a lot of barley. And what we have to do to barley is something called malting. And a lot of people really are like, what exactly is malting? What do we mean by malted barley? Well, if you remember from last class, we have our polysaccharides, our many sugars bound up inside of these seeds. And we need to get at those sugars. The yeast needs to get at those sugars to chomp on them to create alcohol and CO2. So we know the yeast needs to eat those sugars, but that barley seed has a hard little shell on it, right? So we need to figure out how do we make it so that we can facilitate that process of the yeast eating those sugars. That's called fermentation. So we got to get at those fermentable sugars. And the way we do that with malted barley or barley is that we must soak the barley in water. Okay, so we want to soak that barley in water, and we want to trick it into thinking that it's going to grow into a beautiful new plant, right? So it's not very nice. We're going to trick it so that it germinates. In other words, it starts to sprout. But before it grows into an entirely new field of barley, we need to dry it so that it stops growing. So the process of soaking barley and then having that germinate or sprout, you see a little sprout, having that germinate, and then drying that again to stop that growth process, that whole evolution of activities is called malting. It's just a simple word we use for that process. Now, what that does is it basically helps us get at and basically helps us so that we can mill, so that we can grind, so that we can get those sugars very available to the yeast. Something else happens in Scotland that people are really curious about. You can see it around the world, but let's say Scotland is most famous for it in an area of Scotland called Islay. And in Islay, they use something called peat to dry the barley. So we have to dry the barley, right? I told you we need to kill that growth. We need to stop those seeds from growing into a new plant. And the way that they do this in Scotland, or many distilleries in Scotland, is they use peat. Okay, so they light peat on fire. Peat is partially dehydrated vegetation. We will get into that much later when we talk more in depth on this in Scotland when we get to the Scottish chapter. But know for now that peat is lit on fire, and they use that fuel source to dry that barley into a nice crispy seed to be able to mill that real easily. And the phenols, which are, if you remember, keep going back a couple of lessons when we talked about some of the aromatics, the phenols, which are some of those molecular compounds that give these incredible aromatics of tar and medicine and earth and iodine, all these things that evoke the sea in Islay. The phenols are imparted into that seed and stay there through the entire whiskey making process. And that is what you smell in your bottle of whiskey that comes from this particular region, or from any whiskey that uses peat to dry their barley during the malting process. So now you know what peated malted barley is. That doesn't mean that all whiskey from Scotland is peated. In fact, out of about 110 distilleries, I'd say maybe about 10 are using peated barley right now, peated malt. If you're in Scotland, they just say malt. They don't say malted barley. It's just implied that you're using barley. But you should know that this is a big myth. Many distilleries do not use peat to infuse flavor into the barley. And brands like that I used to work with, Glenfiddich, or you can have Balvenie, Glenmorangie, Oakentoshan. There's just so many distilleries that do not have that aromatic component in their single malt scotch. So the next time someone says, I don't like I don't like Scotch because I don't like this peaty, smoky, or the medicinal smell. You can remind them that actually a very, very small percentage do that, but they occupy a huge share of voice in the whiskey industry, probably outsized, probably bigger than it should be. It is a specialty product, I think, and it's also a very acquired taste. There's a time and place for peated malts. For me, it evokes these beautiful, wonderful memories of being there, being in Scotland, and just wonderful times that I've had there. But it's not for everybody, and it's not for every night. So now you know a little bit more about malted barley, what malting is, why we do it, where it's really done predominantly, and then how peat plays into that process. So I hope you enjoyed today's class. I'm really excited to see you next week, and we'll hit some more fermentation, mashing, and grain talk.